And voila, everybody, welcome back to All About Trauma. We're here with a guest today, an anticipated guest. We have been talking about your coming, Leonardo, for quite some time. So here it is Leonardo Capozzi, mindfulness-based psychotherapist, who is going to talk to us about mindfulness in the context of trauma and healing in particular. Leonardo, this is the first live that we dedicate to a topic of healing. So it's quite a special occasion for us. We have been talking a lot about the sort of the dark side of trauma and how to recognize it and so on, but we haven't really approached topics of what to do about it. And so today, we're just so excited to have you here to talk about what to do about trauma and how mindfulness can really help us in approaching this healing process. So welcome. I know that you are in Italy at the moment.
Yes, yeah, for a long moment. We lived here now,
Right.
in central Italy. So thank you, Nicholas, and thank you, Renee, for the invitation today. I'm really looking forward to sharing about this topic.
Wonderful. So yes, on my side here, Renee, my friend and colleague, he'll be studio managing all the cameras and so on, as Leonard presents some of the most important topics for this talk. So Leonard, I would love to hear a little bit about your background. I just love that story of yours, and then maybe you can take us more into the sort of technicalities of the topic today. So the floor is yours.
Yeah, sure, Nicholas. So, yeah, I really got interested in the field of trauma and working with people who have been traumatized over 30 years ago when I was doing a master's degree in clinical social work. And at that point, this was in the early 90s, the field of trauma studies and studying and working with people who had been traumatized was really in its infancy. And even the term PTSD was brand new back at that time. And I was in this master's program, and I remember just feeling drawn to studying that area. And it wasn't for a few years after that that I started to kind of connect the dots and see that it was really my own trauma history that I think was providing that interest. So to go back even more years, I was born 2 months premature and spent the first 5 weeks of my life in an incubator. So, you know, thank God from one point of view, because I'm sure that's what helped me pull through and save my life. From another point of view, from the perspective of like attachment theory and from the perspective of trauma theory, it's not a normal experience for a newborn to be isolated like that. So I'm going to kind of click through 3 traumas that I experienced. So that was one. You know, and thank God I was born into a loving family where I was wanted. So, you know, when I went home from the hospital, there was obviously the love and affection and physical contact that wasn't present when I was in the hospital. 5 years later, I was thrown into a swimming pool and sank like a rock. I'd actually learned how to swim a couple years before, but for some reason that instinct didn't kick in. And I sank like a rock and remember just being terrified and looking up and seeing the surface of the pool, you know, receding away. And my brother jumped in and saved me. So that was a second trauma. A third one was 5 years after that, when I was beaten up by what I like to affectionately call this baby gang. We were all 10-year-olds, but I got jumped by these 4 guys, and I got beaten up pretty badly. And I can still recall the terror that I I was experiencing, as, you know, 3 of them were holding me down. The other one was sitting on my chest, you know, hitting me. So I know that's really graphic, you know, material to share. So I hope that isn't triggering to anybody who's listening. But I wanted to start by sharing these 3 stories from my life as an illustration of what trauma is, and then how we can move through it. What trauma is, and how it then shows up in our lives, and how we can then move through it. So those 3 episodes all shared some things in common, which if you've been following Nicholas and Renee on this series on trauma, you're probably already very familiar with. So a traumatic event or a traumatic episode is one in which we feel completely overwhelmed. Our ability to respond, and even quite often our ability to react, is overwhelmed. And there's a sense of immediate threat to one's well-being, and very often to one's life. So really, in all 3 of those episodes that I just shared, those exact criteria were present. And, you know, even for my newborn self, although I couldn't actually think along those lines, and I don't have any conscious memories of that, I'm sure there was a sense of real profound threat, and even life-threatening type of threat. So we all tend to be more familiar with these types of traumas that are very, very obvious. Some people like to call these big T trauma. So that's where there's an immediate threat to life and limb. You know, you can think about accidents, being assaulted, you know, children or adolescents who are physically or sexually abused, people at any age who experience any type of an accident, whether it's a car accident, you know, a plane crash, a natural disaster of some type. It could be a medical emergency, or even certain medical interventions, all of which create this sense in the person of being completely out of control, not having any agency in that situation, and that there is an immediate threat. So that's what we would call big T trauma, and that's what tends to be associated with the more negative outcomes of trauma, which don't always happen. It's actually a very, very small percentage of people who experience big, dramatic traumas like this, who then go on to develop what's called post-traumatic stress disorder. So that's kind of a quick look at what some people call big T trauma. Now, there's also something called little t trauma, and that is something that is much, much more common. And that would be smaller incidents that all of us are used to experiencing, that especially if they accumulate over time, can lead to difficulties in emotional and mental functioning. They might not necessarily lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, although in some cases it might, but that would be much, much more rare than, for example, if there were a big T trauma that somebody was exposed to. So these little T traumas can be, you know, interpersonal conflict, the end of a relationship, losing one's job, having a very small accident, one that might not necessarily be considered life-threatening, but one that does activate the fight, flight, freeze response, which we'll talk about in a moment. Because anytime the fight, flight, freeze response is activated, it's because the organism feels threatened in some way. So depending upon the person, some little t traumas, especially if they're very, very cumulative over time, can also lead to some distress. But as I just mentioned, it's very, very rare that will lead to somebody meeting all the criteria for a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. So some of the things that people experience when they experience trauma, in the aftermath of the trauma, is intrusive thoughts, intrusive dreams, flashbacks and memories of the trauma that just arrive out of nowhere, or that might happen in kind of compulsive way, where the person gets lost in thought loops, just going over and over again about what happened. So there are those intrusive thoughts and feelings that can come up around what happened. Another part of it is a person can feel very overstimulated in different ways. The nervous system goes on high alert, and the person can feel anxious, the person can feel restless, the person can feel jumpy and irritated. And this has to do with, people who might feel more anxious than usual in the wake of a traumatic event of some type, or people who might feel more irritable than they normally would before having experienced the traumatic event, which might even relate to episodes of losing one's temper. So just that general sense of feeling overstimulated and not able to settle and calm oneself, which can also relate to sleep issues. And then another aspect, which is very common, and it's really a telltale sign of somebody who's struggling with post-traumatic stress, is a desire to avoid anything that brings up memories, anything that brings up thoughts or recollections, or even physical sensations and experiences that somehow relate to the trauma. And interestingly, and also, it's really one of the more difficult parts of working with people who have experienced trauma, is that it's a really natural reaction of our organism to want to avoid. Who wants to relive any of those thoughts or emotions or sensations? None of us would. So then this avoidance mechanism comes up, but interestingly, it's that avoidance mechanism that actually feeds the traumatic reaction. And it's that avoidance mechanism that can keep a person stuck in that traumatic reaction. As I was doing a little preparation for today's presentation, I was listening to a particular YouTube video, and I was reading in the comments, and one of the comments to one of these videos was really striking. This gentleman wrote in his comment that for decades he had been experiencing really severe symptoms of post-traumatic stress. And he'd tried a number of different therapeutic techniques and, things that helped him to a degree. But it wasn't until one day when he just decided to surrender to the experience of all of those awful thoughts and feelings and sensations and emotions, and to be present with them and let them be. And he said he did this a couple of times, and he had this amazing step forward in his ability to hold the experience in a different way and to not feel as much distress. So this is getting a little ahead of myself here, because that's getting into some issues related to how to work with traumatic stress. But I'll come back to that in just a moment. So another thing that's very important to keep in mind in relation to stress in general is that stress is traumatic stress, also regular garden variety stress, because post-traumatic stress is basically, think of it as an intense, extreme, overwhelming experience of stress. So we can all relate, whether we've ever experienced a big T trauma or not, that stress and post-traumatic stress is held in the body. And it's really through the body that we can manage to go in there and kind of untangle the knots. And we're going to get into that quite in depth when we're talking more about treatment. But it's good just to have that concept in mind that when a person experiences trauma, it's something that's actually held in the body as a body memory. Okay. Another interesting thing about post-traumatic stress is that you don't have to necessarily experience it yourself to be traumatized. People who work in the helping professions, first responders, loved ones and friends who are in close contact with people who have experienced, in particular, a really severe, what we're calling a big T trauma. It's not unknown for people in close proximity with those people who actually experienced it firsthand to also experience trauma. And that's one reason why medical professionals and mental health professionals and first responders who are frequently in contact with people and situations that can be considered traumatic, it's important for those folks to have a place to talk about their experiences, to express the thoughts, the feelings that are coming up around those things, and ideally to have some type of a body-based practice in order to help process through that energy. And we'll come back to that again in just a moment. So another aspect of trauma, which is really marked and very evident, is that a sense of shame is very often connected with a trauma, especially if it happens to be a very, very serious, what we're calling a big T trauma. It's very common and almost axiomatic that when a person experiences a trauma, there is this reaction inside, which has a lot to do with this aspect of ourselves that we can all probably relate to, and that is the self-critical voice. The self-critical voice or the other critical voice, but it's that voice that tends to be very, very judgmental and very, very critical. And when a person goes through a traumatic event, quite often that voice gets activated in a very, very powerful way, and it becomes part of the symptom picture of that person trying to think their way through the trauma. Like, why did this happen? Why did this happen to me? For combat veterans very often, and not just people who survive accidents, siblings who perhaps don't receive the brunt of an abusive parent's, rage or abuse. Maybe they come out of that situation a little bit better off than some of the siblings. And in any of these particular types of situations, there can be the sense of shame that comes up, even a sense of guilt, survivor guilt, which is probably a term that you've all heard before. So shame is really a cardinal, piece of the picture. And when we get more into how to address trauma, that is going to be really front and center. So the last thing I want to share is the good news about this picture, and that is that as prevalent as trauma is in our culture, as debilitating the effects of trauma can be, evolution has equipped all of us with a nervous system and with a mind that is able to work with this material. So this doesn't mean that, in particular, a person who has experienced, really big T trauma, perhaps for an extended period of time, which can lead to something called complex PTSD. That's basically where there are many different layers to it. Maybe there are various different traumas that are overlaid one on top of another. But at least from my perspective, the good news that I bring out of all this is that as human beings, we're equipped with the tools, the innate tools, to work with this material. And very often, most often, it requires, the guidance of somebody who has experienced this to some degree themselves, and then who has the professional training to kind of walk through it with the person. But that can come in many shapes and sizes as well. It doesn't necessarily have to be a therapist. But the main idea just being that all of us are equipped with the tools to come back to ourselves, to re-inhabit our bodies, and to reach a place that we can look back and say that, well, this experience and these many years or perhaps many decades of suffering around this trauma has been so horrible in so many ways, and yet, because I was willing and able to enter into a new relationship with it, and able to choose to come back into my body through these different exercises and approaches that we're going to talk about right now, I'm actually a wiser person, a deeper person. I've got more of a perspective on life, and there's even a degree of sense of agency and even happiness that can come through in these particular situations. So I hope that kind of quick overview of what trauma is and some of the main points that relate to it and how it shows up for us are clear. And now I want to move into, well, how do we work with trauma? So in my own case, going back to these three cardinal traumas that I experienced, and then me being, kind of unconsciously drawn towards studying about trauma and trauma treatment when I was in grad school and then in my work afterwards, I look back at how it's been a slow and patient process, like I just alluded to a moment ago, of coming back into my body. When we feel traumatized, there is such an overwhelming sense of a loss of agency and a loss of control that our nervous system, as a way of protecting us, dissociates from the present moment and even dissociates from the body. There are many ideas about why that happens, which we don't have time to go into right now, but it's really a protective mechanism that is part of our evolutionary heritage. And the difficulty of it is that this protective mechanism, while it serves us in the moment, if it continues over time, it can really disrupt our normal daily activities and our ability to be present for ourselves and for the people that we care about, for our careers, for our children. And that's where so much of the difficulty and suffering of traumatic stress can come in. So in my particular case, at a fairly young age, I was naturally drawn towards a meditation practice. The particular meditation practice that I was drawn to at first was very, very mental. It was very, very much kind of up in the head. It was about concentrating and being present in that way. just instinctually, as the years passed, a few years that I was doing this particular practice, I started to feel like there was something missing, and that was the presence of the body, and then the ability to take some of the really painful, dark content of my mind and body, so some of the emotions, the anger, the anxiety that I experienced that I think was directly related to some of these traumatic episodes. Instead of just concentrating on the light, which this first meditation technique I was doing was all about, I gravitated more towards what's called mindfulness practice, which opens up space for us to meet ourselves exactly as we are in the moment, with all of the difficulties, with all of the darkness, with all of the light, with all of the discomfort in the body, whatever that happens to be. Mindfulness, which we're going to get much more into in the next few minutes, is really a way for us to approach trauma recovery, also in a way that's very sensible and in a way that is very safe, because there isn't one size fits all, and every person needs to approach their healing process based on their own abilities, their own capacities, their own sensitivities and sensibilities, and what feels healthy and supportive to them in the moment. So in my own case, it's really been this decades-long process of doing particular practices that just continually give me the opportunity to choose to sit with uncomfortable emotions, uncomfortable thoughts, feelings, and sensations, and to bring an element of self-kindness and compassion and, dare I say, love to this difficult process that is unfolding inside of us, those of us who have experienced trauma. And I would say that ultimately, trauma recovery has two different components to it. One component is this very intentional decision that we can make to come back to our bodies, to kind of reintroduce ourselves to our lived experience in our bodies. And I'll talk about some ways to do that in just a moment. And this is really based on the idea, like I mentioned previously, that trauma is held in the body. There's a very, very popular and well-received book on trauma and trauma recovery called The Body Keeps the Score. If you haven't checked that out, I highly recommend that particular book, because it really sums it up in the title of the book. So the one aspect is this bodily aspect. So trauma treatment and trauma recovery is really about finding ways to come back into the body. And the other aspect is opening up to this innate quality that we all have to be in the present moment with a quality of kindness and curiosity even about what it is that we're experiencing in the moment. Even if it might be the most uncomfortable, painful moment that we would never choose for ourselves, there is a way for us through these practices, and I'm going to just kind of call this mindfulness practice. I know for many people, when they hear the term mindfulness, they think of sitting on a cushion meditating, but that isn't necessarily all that mindfulness is about. In fact, it's not. A person could have a very well-developed mindfulness practice and never do a moment of meditation on a cushion in their life. Mindfulness is actually this innate capacity that we're all endowed with, which goes back to that good news that I shared about trauma and the traumatic experience, that good news that it's workable, and that if we choose to intentionally meet our experience with this particular attitude that I'm calling kind and curious, we could also call it non-judgmental or open and welcoming. If we're able to meet the present moment in that way, trauma can actually be transformative. There's a whole new field of study called post-traumatic growth, and that's studying exactly that phenomena, the transformation and the growth, the positive transformation and growth that people can experience from working with their trauma or their traumas in this particular way. So there's a little, we'll call it a formula that is operative when we decide to address our trauma and the after effects of our trauma using mindfulness practice. And this little formula is pain plus resistance equals suffering. So any of us who have experienced any type of trauma in our lives, we know that that is a painful experience and that it comes with a whole set of after effects which are very disagreeable and painful. From this perspective of mindfulness practice, and again, let me define the term. So mindfulness is the state of mind that we experience when we intentionally choose to be present in the moment with a attitudinal quality that we can call kind and curious or non-judgmental. There are many different ways to describe that. But it's this basic process of choosing to be present with this certain attitude, which then opens us up to being present with the thoughts, the feelings, the physical sensations in a different way. And the hypothesis behind all of this, and it's something that I have actually experienced for myself in doing the experiment of bringing mindfulness to the traumatic content that I've experienced. We can all experience that for ourselves, like a little experiment that we run. And the hypothesis is that when we're able to be present for ourselves in this way, that something transforms, that there is something very positive that is revealed to us through going through this process. Now, turning towards our pain can sound really counterintuitive. Of course, we have this mechanism inside of us that wants to get away from pain, that wants to escape pain. And that's a completely normal human feeling, and I think we need to honor that part of ourselves. It actually takes quite a bit of courage also to do this work. So we could say that not only is mindfulness choosing to be in the present moment with this kind and curious attitude, it's really a kind and curious and courageous attitude. So coming back to the little mathematical formula, pain plus resistance equals suffering. So the trauma has happened. We all know that actually life, just even in its non-traumatic aspects, is full of painful experiences. There's no escaping that as human beings. The part of this little formula that's optional is the resistance, because it's the resistance in addition to the difficulty that leads to us to feel what we call suffering. So when we choose to engage in mindfulness practice and the many different varieties that comes in, but again, the basic structure of the practice, whether we're doing a sitting meditation or a walking meditation, or we're doing a body scan, or we're doing a mindful movement practice like yoga or Tai Chi or Qigong, or whether we're just going through our normal day and we're choosing to be more mindful when we're walking the dog, or when we're doing the dishes, or when we're brushing our teeth. These are all opportunities for us to be present to our experience in the moment. And those who have experienced trauma in some form or another know that, you know, whether we're choosing to do sitting meditation or walking meditation or yoga or whatever, which can all be very helpful, or whether we're out walking the dog or brushing our teeth or doing the dishes, the problem is that that painful content shows up when we're doing these things. The intrusive thoughts, the feeling of restlessness in the body, and then that natural desire to want to avoid anything that's going to remind us of the trauma or is going to bring up these thoughts or feelings or sensations. So anytime we choose to engage the moment in this mindful way is an opportunity for us to see where our resistance comes up. And that's where we bring this sense of kindness and curiosity and even courage to inquiring inside of ourselves. So where is the resistance to this moment right now? At the same time, we can choose to bring those same qualities directly into our experience of the pain. You know, whether it's a feeling of the heart racing, or our breath feels very short. Maybe we're having even a panic attack in the moment, or we're having thoughts that are racing and really overwhelming us. Up until a point, if it's within what we call our window of tolerance, we can bring mindful awareness to these experiences. We can go into what's called our observer self to actually see these experiences as they're unfolding. It's like we're the player coach, because we're seeing them unfolding, but we're also experiencing them at the same time. And this is a crucial aspect to what I'm presenting today. This is when these experiences are within what we call our window of tolerance. So what's the window of tolerance? The window of tolerance is that space inside of us where we feel like, as painful as this moment is, as painful as this thought is, as painful as this sensation or this emotion is, I've got this. I'm not feeling overwhelmed. I'm present with my breath, or I'm feeling myself here in my body. And at the exact same time, I'm able to be present with this distressing content, with that painful content. And in that way, we're working with the resistance very skillfully by choosing to stay with that experience. Now, this is super important. Anytime we feel like we have gotten even just the littlest amount outside of our window of tolerance into a sense of overwhelm, then that's gone a little bit too far. And in that case, if a person were, say, doing a mindfulness practice of some type, that would be time to suspend the practice, to open one's eyes, to get up and get a cup of water, to splash some cold water in your face, maybe to put on some pleasant music. So the idea being that we want to always be very, very sensitive to our own innate capacities and sensibilities and what might potentially bring us out of our window of tolerance into that sense of overwhelm. It's for this reason that those of us who are working with trauma, especially if it's been quite significant trauma that's had some really impactful ramifications and consequences in our lives, in those cases, undertaking mindfulness practice or any other practice in order to directly address the trauma, to come back into one's body, to come back into relationship with one's body and with thoughts and feelings that can be very painful. In that case, it can be really helpful to have a guide, you know, whatever form that takes, whether it's a therapist or an experienced meditation teacher who also has some experience with trauma, or whether it's a religious figure of some type, priest or a rabbi, but, somebody who has experience in this particular area. This all speaks to what's called trauma-informed mindfulness practice. So all that means is that there is a real recognition that doing these practices, and again, I want to underline that mindfulness isn't so much about the practice that you choose to do, whether it's a sitting meditation or a walking meditation or a body scan or whatever that happens to be. It's really about this decision to choose to be present with the painful content, with this attitudinal quality of openness and kindness and curiosity and courage. Anytime we choose to undertake that work, we have to be extremely sensitive to our needs and really be listening to our organism and to its feedback to us to ideally ensure that we don't get out of our window of tolerance and into that place of overwhelm. So some really, really practical aspects of mindfulness practice. I've already, mentioned kind of the core and kernel of the practice, and even what some of the different practices are. But let's take a really close look at one particular practice, which is quite popular. It's a concentration practice where a person sits down, either on a chair or on a cushion, and they gently close their eyes, or you can have your eyes open with your gaze softly focused either down on the floor or, maybe an object on the wall. And then the person makes the choice to be present to their experience with their focus concentrated on a particular object of attention. Now, in trauma-sensitive mindfulness practice, we really try to encourage people to be very open to what their preferred object of attention might be, because it might not be the breath. The breath for some people who have survived trauma can actually be very triggering, because the breath is something that we experience in this main axis of our bodies. And some people aren't ready to get that close in and intimate with their bodily experience when they're first starting this process. So instead of using the breath as a focus of attention, people can use the sensations of what are called the points of contact, the sensations of the feet in contact with the floor, or the sensations of their hands resting on their laps or on their legs. Conversely, a person might use bringing attention to ambient sound and just being acutely aware with this attitudinal quality of openness and allowing to the sounds in the environment. Or at the same time, maybe a person is more visual and they choose to focus on a candle flame or on the image of a particular teacher or spiritual figure or inspiring person or figure that they feel safe with. And their attention goes onto that image, not in a way to like analyze or think about the image, but just as a way to bring focus into the moment. So there are many different ways to bring our attention and focus into the present moment with this particular attitudinal quality of kindness and curiosity and courage. And it really depends on the individual and their particular needs and desires and preferences. At the same time, some people who are working with traumatic content find that walking meditation is very, very supportive to them. This is especially true for people who are experiencing a lot of restlessness and perhaps a lot of anxiety, and sitting down, even with their eyes closed, just feels intolerable. So getting up and moving, and whether that's a mindfulness whether it's mindful walking, where the person brings attention to the sensations created from the hips down to the soles of the feet as they're walking. Conversely, some people like to go out into nature and do the walking meditation, and in that case, they'll open up all their senses if that feels safe to them, if they feel protected and secure out in that natural setting. To go out and open all their senses, the sense of touch, the air against the skin, the olfactory sense, smelling perhaps the pine leaves, the pine needles, feeling their feet on the ground. And this is a way to come back into the body. And then, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, there's also mindful movement, mindful yoga, mindful tai chi, mindful qigong. There are many, many different ways for us to go through this process. So, a few points about this process of coming back into a relationship with one's body and coming back into relationship with the here and now, which is really at the root of healing from traumatic stress. We don't heal from our traumatic stress back in our memory banks where the traumatic stress happened, reworking it and trying to come up with some solution to it. We heal from traumatic stress in the present moment in our bodies. And these mindfulness practices that I just outlined are one way to do that. And some more general principles to keep in mind are, one is to really set an intention to listen to your body's needs and your body's impulses. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about things as simple as the need to drink, the sense of thirst, the need to use the bathroom, hunger pangs, just having a bite to eat when we feel hungry. These are all cues from the body that people who have experienced traumatic stress, especially if it's a big T stressor, these are all physical cues from the body that can often go overlooked. And sometimes people can ignore the need to go use the bathroom for hours, or ignore the need to eat, or ignore the need to take a rest. So, in keeping with the title of that book, The Body Keeps the Score, just this one intention can really bring us a long way towards recovering from trauma. And it's really at the bedrock, because if we're not taking care of our basic essential needs, the body is going to constantly feel like it's threatened. So another thing is orienting to our environment, because that's one thing that can tend to go out the window when a person experiences traumatic stress. It's part of this dissociation from the body and from sense of place. So this can look like making the intentional decision when I enter into a room to take a few seconds to just orient myself in time and space. And that can go for getting into the car, for going outdoors, walking along the sidewalk. What it basically is, and this is very much in keeping with mindfulness practice, it's a decision to not get lost in the thought loops, which are what very often drive the traumatic memories and the traumatic reactions. It's an invitation to snap out of our thought loops, to come into the body and to be present and oriented in time and space. And that is a mindfulness practice right there. The third one is gentle sensory stimulation. So as you can imagine, that's another way that we very gently and easily, well, it might not be easy, but we very gently and in a safe way come back into our bodies through very, very gentle sensory stimulation that feels safe to us, that feels secure to us. Whether that's, I don't know, taking a bath, doing a mindful movement exercise of some type where you really feel the presence of your body, standing and assuming what's called the mountain pose in the yoga tradition, and just being there in the mountain pose and noticing how even when we're standing still, the body is constantly adjusting its position in order to keep our balance. So we're not really standing still when we're standing there in mountain pose. The body is doing all these little micro adjustments, and that very subtle little sensory input that we're getting and sensation that we're getting from the body, when we bring mindful awareness to it, can be very, very healing for our nervous system. And then finally, there are a whole slew of techniques, approaches, exercises that we can do. I've already named a number of mindfulness practices that can be very, very helpful. There's another idea which comes from the psychotherapy world, and that is having what's called a resource box. And what a person can do is have a box, and what they do is fill it up with all their favorite stuff that stimulates the different senses. So they're going to have something in there that is very, very pleasant to the touch. Maybe it's a little tiny stuffed animal with a really, really soft, plush covering to it. And just holding this stuffed animal in your hand and perhaps stroking it creates a very, very nice, pleasant sensory stimulation, which you then choose to be very, very present with and aware about what it is that you're experiencing there in the moment. Just staying present with that tactile sense. You might also have something in there that's very colorful, or a number of things of different colors in order to stimulate the visual sense. And again, the invitation here is to inhabit the body, to come back to our senses, literally, and to be very, very present to those visual cues, to be present with the color red, with the color blue, with the color green, and to notice the different qualities and characteristics of the objects that you chose that have this particular color. And again, what this does is it gets us out of our head and out of the automatic thinking, which can very often keep us trapped in some of these traumatic reactions, and it brings us into the present moment. At the same time, you might have something in there that smells good, maybe a little bottle of an essential oil, or I don't know, a little bottle of cinnamon sticks, or something that's pleasant to the olfactory sense, and you can just smell that and choose to be very, very present with your sense of smell. So basically, this little resource box can be full of all these different little things that you feel safe with, you feel comfortable with, and that can be a way for you to connect back in with your body in that present moment. Another thing which I really have found incredibly helpful, especially in these last few years, is doing something called coherent breathing. And coherent breathing is where you activate the diaphragm muscle and you breathe down into the belly. So on each inhalation, the belly expands, and on each exhalation, the belly contracts. And the expansion and contraction is of the same length of time. You know, you can count to yourself maybe up to 5 seconds or 6 seconds, or there are even apps or videos on YouTube that have a little timer. And what this belly breathing does is it very strongly stimulates the parasympathetic nervous system. The parasympathetic nervous system is the part of our nervous system that allows us to rest and digest, to calm down, and to feel comfortable and at ease in our skin. And it's the paired part of the nervous system with the sympathetic nervous system, which is the part that is in charge of what we call fight, flight, freeze. So you can imagine that when we're feeling stuck in some of the emotions or thoughts or physical sensations related to trauma, that has to do with the sympathetic nervous system being very stimulated. So anything we can do to stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system, and everything I've talked about so far, all these different mindfulness practices, this resource box, and then this type of breathing called coherent breathing, are all very, very strongly stimulating to the parasympathetic nervous system. The one thing to be careful with the diaphragmatic breathing is that if you have any sensitivity to bringing awareness to the breath, obviously this might not be a practice that you'd want to engage in up front, but it might be something that you could incorporate into your recovery work down the line a little bit. So let's see if there's anything else related to tools. Well, there are actually so many. Actually, I'm going to share just two more, and this comes from the world of somatic experiencing. And one of those is the self-hug. So actually, if you take your right hand, let me change the angle of my camera here. You can take your right hand and you put it right kind of over your heart with your fingers there under your arm there. And then you bring your left hand around and take hold of your right upper arm. And this is seemingly this very, very benign little movement that we can do. And what effect would this have? Well, the research actually shows that when we assume this particular position, and the same is true for when we just take a hand and put it on our heart, or maybe you can take both hands and put them on your heart, like this, that the body responds positively. Let's say the mind body responds positively to these very simple little gestures of self-care. And they've shown, through the research clinically, that this can be very, very calming, and on the level of neurotransmitters and hormones and all of that, we're taking care of ourselves, and the body actually feels safer and is able to calm down. So let's see, readjust this. And I think I've gotten through all of my major bullet points here, Nicholas and Renee. So
Fantastic.
let's open it up to a little discussion and maybe some questions, and maybe there's some things that I didn't touch on that are important. And
Wonderful.
I have to excuse myself for just a minute because I need to plug my computer in. I didn't see that my computer's not
yes,
plugged
sure,
in.
sure. Go and get the
Yeah,
cable.
I'll
We'll have a
back.
little chat here. Renee, I was fascinated. First of all, a big thank you from me to our colleague here, Leonardo Capozzi. I feel so enriched. How are you feeling right now?
I feel enriched as well. In fact, the fact that he was able to touch on so many things you've dealt with in former lives, that trauma exists in the body. That is something that he has repeated over and over again in this session, and how that there is some obvious trauma, what we would call classical trauma. He's also highlighted that. He's also highlighted vicarious trauma, that the individuals who actually get to experience trauma while helping other individuals who go through trauma. So I really feel vindicated, and it's such a refreshing thing to hear Leonard explain it in his own field. So thank you so much.
Yeah, for me too. I'm fascinated by this idea of the resource box. So much so, in fact, that as I was listening to you, Leonard, I went to pick up something that would definitely fit in my resource box. It's a little piece of wood that I really like because it's really ancient, and it has almost carbonized. It's one of those pieces of wood you probably find in an archaeological site. And so that element of enduring nature just fascinates me. It sort of enlarges my perception of time, and changes my focus from something that is happening right in the present to something that is more meaningful at a larger level, right? We maybe should talk a bit more about this, because just as much as mindfulness allows us to be really present, it also relaxes our sense of time, I believe. I love to hear a bit more about that, but I'll show you that, like, I put like a little cat on top of that, and then I have this little dog that just is here and stares at this very, you know, cool looking, unmoving cat. And so there is this playful element of like the little dog just wanting to play, right? This liveliness to it. And then this very cool, almost yogish, you know, kind of cat there. So this would definitely fit. And I know, Rene, maybe you have got something also to show and tell.
Absolutely. In fact, when you talk about resource, I have a perfume here that I get, and I got here locally, that when I open it, the scent is something that I really enjoy, and it really gets me to a point of feeling a space, and creates an atmosphere. When Leonard, you explained that when you get into a space and you're able to just feel into the space, this is what actually I feel when I apply it, when actually even there's a candle to it, that I think it has already been depleted, but it really makes me feel in presence and makes me enjoy the scent. It's a very refreshing scent, and it really would be in my resource box. So thanks for explaining it and seeing it that way.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yeah. And another one that comes to mind, Leonard, in terms of somatic sensory sort of stimulation, I've really helped myself a lot, particularly towards the beginning of my journey, which is often the hardest part of the journey of recovery, actually. I remember finding out just out of exploring, and then I saw indeed that there is some science that is now becoming so popular that we even see some Instagram videos running through this science. But it's, you know, caressing this part of the body here, and then also self sort of brushing, not, what would you call it, petting the hair on the head here, just on the side. And then another one very interesting is actually do what I think our mothers did for so long, which is just to tap on the buttock here, like when you are a baby being held in the, you know, arms of the mother, or when she's holding you, and right, like, so typically she will be patting your buttock. And I find that very, very soothing. And I'm thinking that even our mothers are just being intuitive about all of this, right? Like, of course, we see it all around, but they're also just doing it out of instinct. So there must be some receptors there, some particular neurological sort of issues related to this relaxation response, right?
Yeah, those are wonderful examples. And I mean, you're reminding me of the book that you actually inspired me to start reading, which I'm reading right now. Touching, right, by Ashley Montague.
Yeah.
I'm just in the first part, but he's already in the first 25 pages. He's spoken so profoundly, and this is older research too, because the book, I think, was published in the early 70s, and he's citing research from the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s that was already showing the importance of human touch. And, you know, not just for normal healthy development in you know, a baby and a child and young person who hasn't been traumatized, but just imagine those of us who are dealing with trauma, especially from childhood, and just how healing and important touch is. And, you know, one thing I didn't mention, which obviously connects with that very closely, is the importance of social support and social contact for people who are going through a process of recovery from trauma. You know, for some people, unfortunately, that can be very hard, especially in the United States. There are so many people who live alone, so many people who are alienated from their families, and there's been a real breakdown of community in the last 50 years. So that can be a very difficult one, but it's a good point to keep in mind, and I hope to any of you who might be listening or watching who might find yourself in that position, it could be a good incentive to stretch outside your comfort zone a little bit, and perhaps see if there's any way to create some social contact for yourself and some community, whatever that might look like.
I like to slowly go back to this idea of separation with the body, and really maybe dive deeper into how that happens. Maybe the three of us can even maybe try to tune in into our bodies and see parts of ourselves where we are separated right now from ourselves and how that might be happening. But on our way there, there is a particular there's two experiences I like to share. One is the experience of a client of mine that I will call Miss J, just to maintain her anonymity, with whom I'm working a lot with grief. And actually, one of the things that are kind of difficult to deal with in this particular case is that this sense of grief is very vague. There is this sense that we don't know where the boundary of this grief is. It's all very loose, and the terrain is like jelly, not solid. And part of the story of Miss J is that at the age of 5, which is quite a critical point in our development, her sister is born, and just a year before that, one uncle, a brother of her mother, begins to be sick with cancer and will end up dying almost really within a week of the birth of the child, of the second child. And then another brother, a bit after the birth of this child, will get sick again and also will die actually quite quickly soon after, which will lead to the sickness of her mother, to a point where the mother was constantly physically in pain, and probably psychological sort of resistances were probably playing in that mix. And so the child, the client that I'm dealing with, and her father were not able to touch the mother anymore, because even touching her a little bit would send her into screaming. And what I want to point out here is that my client hasn't gone through any personal trauma as such, but she has vicariously, because first of all, she has lost relatives, and then she lost the attention of being the first child, and she lost being a child because suddenly she had to grow up into a person that took care of herself. She lost, as she tells me, she lost a happy father, a father that could touch and hug and cuddle and have sex and intimacy with his wife, and couldn't suddenly anymore. She lost the attention of a mother and the availability of a mother. Nothing has really happened that sees her as the central piece of that trauma story, but yet here she is, confused, unable to know in which direction to go in her life, and really this sense of where am I, who am I, right? So that's one piece, first piece. And then another one that brings us back to this sense of contact with the body and this mindfulness. I remember I was working, so before I became a psychotherapist, I was working as a teacher. I worked as a teacher for about 15 years, teaching sports and languages, even working as a primary school teacher for some time. And I was in a kindergarten in Japan once, and I was in charge of this 5-6 years old class. And we went outside on the courtyard, and everybody was playing. And at some point, some children come running to me and say, teacher, teacher, sensei, sensei, and as they say in Japanese, come, right? And I come, and there was this child who had fallen down and was crying, and he turns around, and he's like, his mouth and neck is covered in blood. And so I take him, maybe I took him in my arms, so I take him by hand slowly, I guide him, and we go to the bathroom. I call the leader of the class and I say, you keep an eye on everybody now, you just sit down there and you be the teacher for a little while. And I went to the bathroom with him, and we started to rinse him. And first I rinsed and cleaned his face and his neck, and then as the wound was getting cleaner and cleaner, I asked him to use the water and the tap to rinse himself. And really what I was doing there is that I wanted to assess the level of injury. I wanted to see the injury. And it was so amazing how during this process, this child went from being in a state of panic to looking into the mirror, like I will do what he did now, as if this was the mirror. And he was like, you know, and then he would take the water because blood was actually flowing. You know, he had basically this typical injury of completely breaking his sleep, right? So a lot of blood is coming out. So a lot of blood would keep coming out, but he was like analyzing and putting more water just to clear the blood, and then again looking and right, exactly, curiosity. And I feel we went together in a meditative state. So if before we saw how a relationship, somebody outside of us, can vicariously transmit trauma, here I think we are seeing the vicarious transference of a calm, regulated, meditative state towards the situation. I can be very surgically sort of calm when that happens, because I lost my sister to drowning when I was 5, and I saw the CPR going on. So I think, you know, I've absorbed a certain quality of awareness and presence there. But here it is, him and me, him and the child, we are, I think, one organ in that moment. And suddenly, because of that safety, because of that mindfulness, curiosity, you know, blooms. And it was just incredible. Slowly, eventually, the blood started to flowing less. We put a piece of paper, and then we went back out to call everybody into the class. And then we went out to call the principal or something, to call an ambulance, because it was obvious then that he had to get some stitches. By the way, I was fired after that episode, right after that episode. The day after, I went back to school, and they sent me home for 3 days, and then I was told that I'd been fired because I'd handled the question, why didn't you call the principal and the ambulance immediately? So this sense that we were in control, that the child was in control, which was very much a wish of mine to let the child know that he had the power to handle this, was totally wrong. I literally lost my job for it. But you know, I've never ever regretted what I did. It was just an absolutely incredible experience. I'm so happy to just recount it here. So yeah, that's my input here, Leonard. I love to hear your response.
Well, to the episode with that child in Japan, my sense is that your response was so spot on, because you provided a calm, stable presence for him. And, you know, children learn how to, I know you guys know this, children learn how to process their emotions from how the adults in their life process their emotions. And I bet he was really scared and a bit confused and didn't know exactly what to do in that situation. And you stepping in and being present and calm and curious, and of course having his welfare in mind, you know, he knew that. Like, you communicated that to him, and that's a really precious lesson that you shared with him. And I'm sorry that, I'm sure it ended up being okay in the end, but I'm sorry that you lost your job for that.
One thing that I'm reminded of, actually, after we sent him to the hospital, I went back into the class, and then we continued this sort of discussion, curious discussion about what had happened and what the other children were fearing would happen. And then we talked about stitches, what stitches are, and the children were asking questions about the pain and the skin, and it was just a whole moment of like exploration and yeah, I would say mindfulness. I don't know why, but I want to call that mindfulness.
Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree. That's a wonderful episode.
And
Yeah, Renee?
Yeah, and the interesting thing about this story, Nicholas, is what I also wanted to bring forward is that I think that a way you responded was right in the window of tolerance for that child. Because if you had, I believe, from what Leonard has explained, if you had delayed, maybe that window of tolerance will have passed. He will have continued bleeding, and this kid now it's getting overwhelmed. The blood will be flowing, and he gets overwhelmed. And by the time even the ambulance comes, he feels, oh, what else? I've bled. I need to change my clothes. Everything is soaked. But the fact that, Nicholas, you were able to act within that window really got him to that place of mindfulness. Would you say that, Leonard?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful insight, Renee. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a type of window of tolerance that's a tiny bit different than what I was referring to when we're self-regulating our window of tolerance. But I think it's an excellent example of that principle in that in relationship with Nicholas, the boy's window of tolerance was really respected. And
Yes.
Nicholas was able to be there and kind of hold this space for him in order to provide a window of tolerance.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And we might even argue that his window of tolerance was stretched a little bit because his parasympathetic was being, co-regulating with me, right? We, of course, we beings co-regulate all the time whenever we see each other, particularly when we're in contact, in touch with each other, right? So his window of tolerance could have been stretched. And another thing that makes me think about this situation is that I sort of was very much aware of what might have happened if I'd handled the child and just handed him over to people that with whom he didn't have an intimate rapport. I'd been his teacher for now, I think 6-7 months. Every single child in that class would have had a hug with me, or would have had some words of love and compassion and care. So I was someone close to these children. And the administrators who were not in the classes, who would have taken care of this child, very likely would have treated the child as something foreign to them. Whereas when I was with him looking in the mirror, I was curious, I was caring, he was curious, like we were doing something together, we're coordinating together. It makes me think that part of what might have happened if I had handed it over to these administrators is in a way what we do to ourselves when we separate from our body in the way that you described kind of initially, right? We become the administrators of life, but we don't really step into the wound. I was interacting on the same level with him. I don't think an administrator would have done that.
Yeah. Most likely you're right about that. There would have been a level of alarm and, perhaps even hysteria, which wasn't present in your response to this situation.
So systemically, our ways of working, the people that we have become, the roles that we inhabit, these are systemic forces that on a daily basis, look at this small example, right? A child learning how to be with his own wound as opposed to not being with his own wound if he had gone to the administrator. It's such a small bifurcation there, but leads to a completely different experience. But it shows how our systems are full of these opportunities, and oftentimes the divorce from body is systemically encouraged.
I have a question on that. Actually, on this, and it's actually on the same question that I have on Leonard. Do you think that when something is beyond our window of tolerance and we get overwhelmed, that's when shame comes in? Because even in this context, in the story of Nicholas, if you took the kid to the principal, there will be some shame, because it's like, all these children are playing safety. What happened to you? How clumsy are you to have all the blood? Or what happened? And now maybe he's taken all through the school. The teachers are looking at him as like, what are you so irresponsible to have this happen to you? So would you say that when something goes beyond our window of tolerance and we get overwhelmed, that's when shame comes in.
Yeah. That's an interesting insight, Renee. I think there's a lot of truth to that. And
Me too.
at the same time, even within our window of tolerance, there can still be shame, but it's not the type of shame that that just crushes us, or that carries us out of our window of tolerance into overwhelm. And that is something that takes a lot of practice and a lot of compassion, self-compassion, and patience, to be able to sit with our shame in our window of tolerance. And the more we sit with it in our window of tolerance, it just melts like an ice cube. It's amazing. It's like it can't handle the glare of the light. But I think you're onto something, that when the shame is maybe more powerful, or if we're in a situation where it's not conducive to us being with it, like, to use the analogy of, or the parallel situation of Nicholas's child who fell and split his lip, then the shame can really feel like it's overwhelming, and that's when we're outside of our window of tolerance. And that's really where most of the suffering happens with people who are dealing with traumatic stress.
It seems to be argued.
Addressed your question or not, but
it's I also feel intuitively there's quite a good connection there between window intolerance and shame. I'm thinking modern times we kind of tend to describe shame as that emotion that surfaces when we have done something that we anticipate the group we belong to will reject us for. So in a way, if sometimes we are clumsy, sometimes we hurt ourselves, and just as it happened in this situation with me, somebody was blamed, right? There was blame in the air. I was the one that took the hit, but the child could have taken the hit, and in taking that hit, he might have absorbed that hit in the form of shame, right? I have done something wrong, I am bad, in this very, very simple sort of terms even, right? And in cultures where co-regulation is discouraged, we mentioned the USA before. You did mention the USA as being a special, particular environment for certain of the subjects that you were discussing. I would say that the USA is probably one of the most individualistic countries in the world, or the one that pushes the envelope on individualism and autonomy and this emotional disconnect from one another the most. And so then I would imagine shame to be prolific in such, because whenever we need the other, this is not acceptable. The group is going to reject me because I need it. And sometimes I know that pride is prolific in the USA in terms of people achieving extraordinary levels of autonomy, only to then have a downfall into mental illness a bit later on. But many times we do celebrate autonomy with a certain amount of pride, and so then shame has to go hand in hand with that, because life is just about just as much being your individual, unique self in this universe and the world, but also being connected with others, for sure. No?
Yeah. And I think in the United States, it's such an individualistic society that even people who haven't experienced, well, let's just say a big T trauma, because everybody experiences little T traumas of some sort.
Yes.
But even folks who haven't experienced a big T trauma, or who aren't necessarily experiencing the fallout of traumatic stress, I think the very nature of the society in the United States, because it's so individualistic and community has so fractured in the last couple of generations, that it just generates a sense of shame in and of itself, because we're social creatures. We're built to have contact and to live in groups. And when we don't do that, you know, my sense, I haven't given this tons of thought, but my sense is that there's a part of us that just naturally knows something is wrong. And more often than not, when there's something wrong, that inner voice either blames self or blames other. And it might have something to do with how fractured the politics are in the United States right now, and all of the finger pointing and kind of people wanting to identify with the camp, you know, people wanting to identify with something. So
Yeah, although I've never really presented my ideas about the United States sort of collective psyche, but I will do so now because I think it seems appropriate, and I don't want to be controversial. Although you are encouraged to put in your kind comments below, if you keep good language. But I will say that I personally tend to see all these, the sort of the chaos, the tension of the political system as an outcome of the primary trauma onto which the United States collective is built. You know, there is there is massacre, there is betrayal after betrayal after betrayal, dissociation, separations, all under this wealth, right? Material wealth, this sort of unified collective we call the citizens of the United States today. And that's because of how the early immigrants arrived in the United States and then, you know, treated the local population. And when we talk of divorce, you know, when we talk of separation, and I want to go further now into this idea that ultimately, if there is post-traumatic stress disorder, we must assume a sense of a split, a sense of a too big of a distance between our sense of self and what the body is experiencing. And then that we see that in the United States at this massive collective level, right? The distance that most people have put between the suffering of the Indian population and their own suffering is so big that then we see these very chaotic behaviors and this neurotic, chaotic, oppositional dynamics in society itself.
Yeah, Nicholas, I think there's a lot of truth to what you're saying there. I think there is this primary wound at the heart of the psyche of United States, you know, society in general, and yeah, I think it has a lot to do with the genocide against the Native American peoples, and then of course the fact that, you know, slavery of African peoples, it existed for 200 plus years, and that is something that has never been, you know, really fully addressed. So
something is keeping distance, isn't it? Something in the collective imagination and in the collective dialogue is sometimes willingly and consciously, sometimes unconsciously avoiding certain patterns of language that would fall into you know, acknowledging these realities that live below. We do that all the time with ourselves. How do we do it, and why does it take us so long for us to address trauma in ourselves? It always kind of happens later in the 30s, in the 40s, in the 50s, and you wonder how could I live for so long with this split, right? How do we do it?
Oh yeah, that's such a good question, Nicholas. Well, I'm in my late 50s, and I feel like I'm still dealing, you know, with those traumas from my very, very early life. And, you know, I feel fortunate now at this point, even at this relatively mature age. You know, I feel like I've been on this healing path for, you know, well, I mean, really the better part of more than 3 decades, you know, since I was in my early 20s. It just takes a lot of patience and perseverance and self-compassion. And there's another piece to it, which maybe because of my age, it's sort of like, you know, I'm getting it hammered into my head in a way. Pardon the image, that's a traumatic image. But no, and that is that it's really, I'll just speak for myself. Like, it's okay that I went through those things. I'm a human being, and all of our experiences as human beings, you know, have something in common, and that is that there's this element of difficulty to being a human being. There's this element of it's just hard to be a human being, and of course, some people have that more than others, and some people come from cultures that are more open and more rooted. So in some ways that might not be the way a person would describe it. But in my own case, coming from the culture and the you know, even the ethnic background that I come from as an Italian American, there's just a lot of difficulty. And mine came in those particular ways, and those particular shapes and sizes and flavors. And it's influenced my life in certain ways that haven't always been pleasant. But I feel so blessed that at a relatively young age, I even knew that there was a thing as addressing the trauma and working with it in some way. And yeah, as the decades pass, I guess I'm just feeling that it's okay to have this history, to have these effects that are still present in some ways, and that it's just the human condition, and that I don't have to expect to actually get to some magical day where I can pronounce myself healed in order to feel good in my skin and in order to feel okay with my life and to have moments of joy and happiness. And I'm saying this especially as an American, as somebody from the United States, because in United States culture, there's such an emphasis on perfection and on the external looking all shiny and bright so that it looks good on Facebook and on Instagram and on LinkedIn. And there's this kind of myth and this cult of feeling good and living to be 105 years old or 110, and like it's kind of a psychosis in a way. So yeah, I think part of the healing journey is really opening our hearts to the fact that being a human is not easy, and that it's okay that we have these parts that feel broken. And you know, thank God there are these ways that we can approach these difficulties in life that can make them less difficult to live with, can make them much more tolerable. And then, like I mentioned a couple times, there's even this thing called traumatic growth. Like we can see that we've actually grown through these difficulties.
Absolutely. I think Renee is dying to ask a question or say something.
Yeah, so I actually wanted to pick up on the formula you just said, that pain plus resistance equals suffering. Would you say in this particular instance, this is the form of resistance? The reason why the suffering takes so long is because of some resistance that we have, whether it's numbing or anything of the sort.
Yeah, I think that's right, Renee. And it reminds me of the comment to the YouTube video I watched that I mentioned. That particular person specifically referenced how like decades had gone by of trying this approach and that approach, and things had helped a little bit, but it wasn't until the person just let go of their resistance to feeling fully the presence of the after effects of the traumatic episodes, that the person started to feel like they were really coming to some inner equilibrium. But that's much easier said than done. And who knows if that person ever would have arrived there if they hadn't done those however many decades of work.
It's often the case.
Sort of like some meditation traditions, you know, there's the story of the master who sits down and has this enlightenment experience and realizes that, well, you don't really have to meditate to get there. But who knows?
There was this video that I sent you, Leonard, from the Rinpoche. What's his name again?
Mingyur Rinpoche.
Yeah, and I want to talk for a moment about that one because I was thinking of this moment when we get hurt, right? So I was thinking, if I get hurt on my leg now, the typical reaction is like, right? Like we tighten the lip, we tighten the body, right? And this is particularly for a man, I would say. For a female or a woman, we might imagine screaming, like loud screaming, which I'm not gonna do now, as otherwise my neighbors will take me for some lunatic. But there is sort of a fighting going on there, right? Whether it's in the form of really extroverted signals of danger or worry or panic, or a complete compression of the sensations that are going on in my leg right now, right? If I hit my shin, right? How and why would we do that, and how do you think we move away from that? And I want you to be as sensitive as you can and take us millimeter by millimeter through this process.
Okay, well, let me know, I mean, how sensitive you feel I'm being, and how much millimeter by millimeter I'm going through this. But my first thought that comes to mind is that we're engineered as an organism to want to get away from that which is unpleasant.
Okay.
And to want to hold on to and experience more and more that which is pleasant. You know,
Okay.
I mean, we can think about the times that we've eaten so much chocolate cake that by the time we actually finish the last bite of the chocolate cake, we're like, this is gross. Like, oh my God. So we're so attached to pleasure, right, that we'll just keep forking the chocolate cake into our
until
mouth
it hurts,
till we feel sick. The same actually goes for pain. Yeah, the same goes for pain. And I'll give a really a lived experience. And I'm not sure if I ever shared this with you or not, but when I was just starting to do some mindfulness practice, I was 21, and I was in university. I had just returned to the United States into my university studies after 7 months studying in Rome. And I was making spaghetti alla carbonara, actually bucatini alla carbonara for my two housemates and myself. And I was boiling this huge pot of water. And I wasn't being mindful when I picked up the pot of water. It was heavier than I was expecting. And it slipped out of my hand, and all of the water went onto my left foot, which was bare. I was in the kitchen in bare feet. So my foot got very, very badly scalded. And I ran to the bathroom screaming to my housemates, save the pasta that was on the floor. So they scooped up the pasta and they rinsed it, and we were able to still eat it. But anyway, I was just starting to do some mindfulness practice at that time, and I decided not to take a painkiller that night. My foot really hurt badly. It wasn't burned to the point that I needed to go to the ER, but it was red, it was swollen. And I decided to stay up all night meditating on the pain in my foot. And it was a real life-changing experience because I saw, this is where millimeter to millimeter comes in. I saw that the experience that my mind wanted to label pain, you're in danger, this is a really disagreeable, uncomfortable situation, and you have to do something to intervene. Like, you have to take a painkiller, basically, because there's pain present, like this monolith that arrived. Instead, what I learned from staying up all night, bringing this kind, curious attention to the experience of my foot, I learned that in 1 second, there was a burning sensation, no doubt, and it was very disagreeable. And then in the next second, there was a sensation of pressure. And then in the next second, there was a ticklish sensation. And then in the next second, there was no sensation. And it just cycled throughout the night. The experience of that, in quote, pain wasn't what my mind was expecting. And if I stayed with the experience really closely, I was able to get through the whole night without having to take a painkiller. And I have to say that I think there was some kind of a healing process that happened as a result, because the next day it was sore, it was a little painful, but it was nothing like the night before. And I ended up never having to do anything to treat the scald on the foot. And the take home for me from that was that my mind wants to label my life experiences, whether it's pain or grief or anger or, you name it. And it's kind of a hack or a shortcut that our mind uses in order for us to kind of get through the day, I guess. But we can choose to go under the hood of our experience and bring this very, very attentive quality, moment to moment to what the experience is. And very often we discover that it's very different than what the superficial labeling would tell us about that. And I think the same goes for how we approach traumatic stress and the fallout from traumatic stress. And this kind of relates to shame, Renee, because very often just going through, depending upon the nature of the trauma, but pretty much all trauma will bring up this reaction inside of thinking that we've done something wrong, that somehow I'm to blame. I shouldn't have gotten on the flight. I should have known when I got up in the morning, whatever, with the weather outside, I should have never gotten in the car. I should have called in to work and said I couldn't come in.
I should have read that red flag that was so obvious, and so on.
Yeah.
In a relationship, for example.
In any event, the point being that these stories that we tell ourselves about our trauma are very often, and shame is like one of the main characters in the story, but the stories we tell ourselves about the trauma are often what keep the traumatic reactions alive and active. And that's why there are approaches to therapy, like cognitive processing therapy, where a person sits down and writes not about the trauma, but about the effects of the trauma in their life and how the trauma has affected their relationships, their sense of self-efficacy, their sense of self-esteem, their career, et cetera, et cetera. And they write it out in story form. And then what you do together with the therapist, if you're working with a therapist who does this kind of work, you go through and you identify the thoughts that are basically keeping the traumatic story alive for the person. and this is a cognitive therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy approach, then you go in and you work with the person on that thought structure. Like, how can we understand that? What are your thoughts and feelings about that? Where do you feel that in your body? That's bringing in more of my mindfulness, approach.
What are the behaviors that are consequential to that thought? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And how could you possibly reframe that, recontextualize it, and understand it in a different way that you don't generate all this shame and all this guilt and all this regret? And it's actually been shown in clinical trials that cognitive processing therapy is a very effective treatment for trauma. So,
there is an abundance of research supporting cognitive behavioral therapy, but I have to say it's also the fad of the day. I mean, there is so much money being poured into this particular area of therapy, because insurance policies, particularly in the United States, are all backing up these, and so it's kind of this reinforcing mechanism. I not as a critique, but I think out of experience and out of being actually trained through some of these processes, it seems to me that there is a bit of it doesn't quite touch the body as much as I want a therapeutic process to be involved with. It sort of skims over the somatic experience of
I totally agree, Nicholas, and that's why I didn't mention it before. But I'm wondering, did I address your question? What are your thoughts about what I said in relation to your question from before?
The millimeter, I absolutely love the example that you gave us. It reminded me actually of a day when I decided to, so I have a lot of moles on my body, and some of them, because they are in specific points and rub against the clothes, they get to bleed. And so I've removed them, and I decided there was one here on just here, and I decided to remove it and to actually have no anesthetic being put during the removal, and to practice basically staying mindful and curious. And I remember exactly what you're describing, I don't know if it was a cycle, but it was definitely something moving along the lines of ticklish sensations to more kind of a sense of pressure, to a prickling, more like a needle, prickling, to, and indeed no sensations at all, and for the duration of the whole duration of the operation. It didn't last long. It must have lasted 5 minutes, but it was a very pleasant experience, actually, knowing that I could be so there and present, and the result was the same as when they gave me massive amounts of anesthetics. I remember the first one that was removed here. They gave me so much anesthetic that I couldn't move my arm, for a couple of days. There was nothing really positive coming out of that. One thing I want to mention, Leonard, we walked through this millimeter, process millimeter by millimeter, and I was wondering, when I go, if I hit my shin and I go, this typical sort of male contraction. Well, at a certain level, like this contraction, this tensing up, is slowing down the information that is going between the wound and my brain, because all the nerves are getting tense, right? And probably the screaming is also doing something on that level. We have the gate theory. I don't know if you ever heard about, right? Like this idea that the pain has to go through a gate, and so when you hurt yourself, if there is a lot of space in that gate, then all the pain sensations from the hurt come through. But if you start to rub around where you have had your injury, or you tense your muscles, then there is more information coming through that gate, and so the pain information doesn't get through as much as it should. But I'm thinking, is this reaction, the screaming and the tensing up, a cognitive reaction or an emotional reaction? Because in the mindfulness practice, I have that same question. Are we approaching this presence from a sense of a will to be there in the present, or from an emotional initiator? Is it compassion, or is it, you mentioned kindness, what feeling would that be? That's where my question rests at the moment.
Well, using your example of like stubbing our toe, right, or our knee on a coffee table, I think the immediate impact of that is on the biological level, is just purely on the level of our reactive physiology. And as I mentioned earlier, we're so programmed to want to get away from pain, and to not experience pain, that when we experience it, and we've all stubbed our toe on the coffee table, it can be really intense that first second, right? First couple seconds, such impact. And I don't know about you guys, but for me, a couple times there's been the fear that comes up like that. Oh God, did I break my toe? You know, so then I look down at my foot to see if my toe's sticking out, you know, in the other direction. So all of that happens, I feel, outside of our conscious thought processing, cognitive, you know, process. My sense is that that's all very instinctual, and it has to do with, you know, the lower parts of our brain structure. You know,
right, the brainstem, reflexes, sort of reactions.
Brainstem and the limbic structures. So that first impact feels like it's very much more biological. And then afterwards, though, that's a really, really good question. Like, did I understand the question? Is it more cognitive or is it more emotional?
Yeah, is it a thought that, I know that when I meditate, mind will go, and then I have to operate, like, then I realize it has gone, and then I come back, okay, the breathing, just come back. We often talk about this, coming back to the source, right? In my case, I just focus here on the nostrils, the air coming in and out. In that moment, I apply two things. I apply the image of the nostrils, right? The thought of the nostrils and the air coming in and out. So I come back to a particular thought. And then I apply kindness also. Because as you mentioned before, very quickly there is a tendency of blaming. You're not good enough. You did something wrong, right? And then out of that blame, maybe the shame. Oh, this is not working for me. I'm so bad. I'm so incapable, and so on. So none of that. It's just the thought of the nostrils is focused on. So I've done meditations where I just draw a little dot on a piece of paper. I stick that little paper on a wall, and then I just focus on it, right? It's kind of very, very similar. And then this kindness. And I don't go into any other emotion. So I guess, what do you read out of that?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting because you referenced a thought about the sensations of the breath here on your upper lip. But I'm curious if that's what you really meant, or is your experience when you're doing that particular meditation that in the moment that you're really present with the experience, it's actually a felt sense in the body of the sensation on your lip? Because that, and you know, I have to say that actually my knowledge of the neuroscience probably isn't up to speed in order to answer this question fully. But my sense is that there's something very different between when we're aware of the felt sense of a sensation in the body, which is what mindfulness practice is actually directed towards, because mindfulness isn't a thought about our breath. It's not a thought about the breath creating a sensation here on our lip. It's actually a lived experience in the body of this felt sense of the sensation of the breath here on the upper lip. And my
Yeah,
sense
the
is that
Rinpoche speaks of awareness, right, Leonard? Sorry, interrupting you there. The interest of this particular kind of meditation is not the object of our awareness, but the awareness itself.
Yeah, that's a nice way to put it. And the difference between the two is the difference between a thought form, which we would consider something that's very cognitive, and an experience in the body, which has to do with our sense of, I think it's called interoception. There's part of our brain that in the prefrontal cortex that has to do with feeling embodied as an experience, as a felt sense. And that is this beautiful, it seems like this beautiful combination of physical sensation along with awareness, along with possible cognitive aspects.
Yeah, there is this sense that I'm redirecting my mind, that I would maybe call it the will, or the focus, that I'm bringing something from here back to here, and then again from here back to here, from here back to here, right, for a moment, and then of course then I focus again on the sensations. So but will seems to come into the picture for me at the moment. I'm practicing something that has been recommended by Dr. Shiraz, I think is his name. He talks about positive intelligence, and there is this little trick where he tells you for just 10 seconds, take your thumb and your finger, what is it called? Your index finger. Yeah, and touch them just for 10 seconds. Just pay attention completely to this sensation here. Just touch them as slightly as you can. And I've put myself a reminder, a random reminder on the phone. And the trick here is to stop everything that is going on in my life to do this. Not because this will save me or anything, but because the ability of my mind to focus on something at a random time is like a muscle. It's the ability to take your focus where you want it to be. It's not so much the sensation, but it's to take your attention where you want it to be, and this is something that's very much part of mindfulness practice, no?
Yeah, absolutely. The other part of mindfulness practice, so there's two aspects. One is that ability to direct our attention where we want it to be. Then the other part is that attitudinal quality, that quality of openness and curiosity, kindness. So we like to say that mindfulness, the way that we approach it in this class that I teach called mindfulness-based stress reduction, the way that we define it is mindfulness is the state that we experience when we intentionally choose to bring our attention into the present moment with this non-judgmental quality, or this kind and attitudinal quality. And
that's the kindness. I referred to it as kindness before, right? The sense that I don't go into any other emotion but the forgiving and the kindness.
Yeah, and for some people it's helpful to think about it just in terms of curiosity, because curiosity is also kind of felt sense in the body. We can think of times that we're curious about something. When we're curious about something, we're present, we're open, we're
Yeah.
And it's not a thought, it's a lived experience. And to bring it back to the trauma work, you know, this is a thought that connects with what you're sharing. You know, the real main thing in trauma treatment, as you know, is helping a person develop a sense of safety, a sense of inner safety. Mm-hmm. And mindfulness practice can really support us in this. We might start off with very, very tiny little doses that have nothing to do with sitting down and closing our eyes and doing breath work, okay? It could be having our cup of tea in the morning and being super present to the warmth of the cup in our hands and the aroma of the tea as the steam comes up off the surface of the tea, and the taste of the tea, whatever the tea happens to be, like really being present with this open, curious quality. And the more we practice being open and present with this curious quality, the more we start to realize that there's a part of our experience as human beings that is always here for us. It's always present, always awake, always centered and calm. And that is that internal observer that is aware of experience. And the real gift of mindfulness practice is when we get to that point of being able to be aware of this part of us that is aware. Because when we're able to experience that, we know that we have a home base inside of us that is always here for us, that is always stable, always present and clear. And that is really kind of like the holy grail of what these mindfulness practices can help us cultivate inside. And once we've gotten to that space, maybe that has to do with what I was sharing a little earlier about at my age, I'm at a point where it's just like, well, okay, I had these experiences, there's still effects in my life, they're not very pleasant, but it's okay. Maybe it's because I'm more and more identifying with this place of equilibrium and stability inside of myself as being my true nature. And all of these other experiences that I've had that have had these like effects through the decades, well, yeah, that's part of me too, but it's my story. And there's this part of me that I can experience my story from that is okay with the story being just the way the story is. So there's no longer the demand to have the story change, to feel differently in some way. It's like this moment is enough. Like this breath right now is enough. This sense of being present here right now is enough. Like I'm experiencing that right now with you guys. So yeah.
With this soulful atmosphere that you have brought on, Leonard, Renee, maybe we can come to a close for this live. One of our viewers has been here the whole time, so thank you very much for staying with us. And yes, we want to thank you, Leonard, again for coming on. Renee, thank you again for your managing all the technicalities involved in this live, for bringing on some really beautiful insights and questions. And we will see you all on Saturday for a short live again, and perhaps Leonard on an eventual second coming.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. Thank you very much, Nicholas. Thanks, Renee, and thanks to everybody who was present.
Renee, do you have a last word that you would like to say? Or
absolutely. Thank you again, Leonard, for just coming in and helping us understand the mindfulness and how being present. And I like your definition that it's an innate nature. it's part of our instinct, even though we have some will to it, like Nicholas would be. It's actually just part of our innate nature to bring ourselves to this position. And I hope these different strategies that we have shared will be helpful to anyone. So please watch the playback. It will always be on our channel. And thank you again for coming.
Okay, thank you,
Bye
guys.
bye.